everybody. Welcome,
Check.
welcome. Well, this is great, great start. We had drinks before the event, which I wasn't expecting. We've got beautiful weather and it's standing room only. So my name's Todd Barker with the Meridian Institute, and we're gonna jump straight in. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to longtime colleague, Ruth Richardson, the Executive Director for ASRA. Ruth.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Todd said, I'm Ruth, and I'm the Executive Director of ASRA, the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment. ASRA is a new initiative hosted by the United Nations Foundation. We are home to a global network of transdisciplinary experts and thought leaders who want to see systemic risk assessment as the backbone of policy and decision-making. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event, Facing Global Risks Together, ASRA's first multi-stakeholder convening. This is a milestone moment for us as we gather with others to radically rethink risk as a way to address current and future challenges. And we gather on the eve of the UN Summit of the Future and Climate Week, two events that push us to think deeply about risk and responsibility. We are meeting at a moment of immense complexity, where systemic risks are accelerating at a rapid pace. From climate change and pandemics, to global conflicts and the unchecked rise of AI, the challenges before us are vast. Yet while the stakes are undeniably high, some would argue existential, this moment also holds incredible promise and potential. The urgency of these risks offer us an unparalleled opportunity to come together, to innovate, to act on our collective intelligence and wisdom, and to reimagine and live into a new future. Classically, risk is defined as the potential for adverse consequences, or more simply put, the chance of a loss of something that is valued. So what is it that we value and risk losing? Today's convening is a call for us to stretch ourselves beyond our usual focus on efficiency and profit above all else, beyond single-focused issues with health, climate, biodiversity, security, poverty, all kept in their own corners, beyond considering our species as the one that matters most, to stretch ourselves beyond short-termism and considering only the needs of today and the next election cycle. Today's convening is a call for us to stretch ourselves, to embrace broader things we value, to acknowledge and understand the connection between the challenges we face, especially for the most vulnerable, to recognize our dependence on this beautiful planet and the species we share it with, and to think and plan beyond ourselves for the generations that will follow. I'm excited to welcome a remarkable group of speakers today, thought leaders and experts from around the world who will speak about risk and deepen the conversations so needed today about what we risk losing and what to do. Thank you for being here and for joining the conversation. And I'll now hand it over to Todd Barker, President and CEO of Meridian Institute, who will be our moderator for the event. Todd, back over to you.
All right, you all have an agenda and this beautiful and very substantive report in front of you, but I'm just going to give you a sense of the flow for the event. So we're going to start with a keynote with three speakers speaking about three agenda-setting reports on global risk. And followed by that, we'll have a panel discussion with four individuals that I'll introduce when we get to the panel, who will be talking about practical strategies for addressing risk. We're hoping to have a bit of Q&A with the audience. And then we're very excited to have two closing respondents, two former heads of state, to round out the event, which will wrap up this portion at 6 o'clock. And then we have a reception that follows. It continues until 7:30. So that's our flow for the agenda. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ayaka Suzuki, who's the Director of Strategic Planning and Monitoring in the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations, who will be speaking about an upcoming United Nations report on global risk.
And thank you, and ASRA, for inviting me to. It feels a little bit presumptuous for me to be the first speaker, given that I'm not the risk expert here. But yes, we are working on the first ever global risks report, which was an initiative of our common agenda that Secretary General issued 2021. Wow, that sounds already 3 years. And congratulations on this this gathering. I was actually skeptical that you would be able to get a full room because there's so much happening a few blocks away at headquarters. We just walked over here with my colleague Asma. So yeah, I mean, it's heartwarming that there is this community of people who care about risks and, as you said, to protect what we value. So what can I tell you about the report? I mean, I don't have to tell this crowd that the world has never been so complex. We are living in a public crisis, which is a vogue word, but it really is the situation. The systemic risks are multiplying, intensifying, and disrupting everything, causing irreversible damage to people, communities, and ecosystem. And these risks are not limited to any specific thematic area or region. I mean, there are no corners to hide, really, no corners. And they affect all of us together. So that's really kind of the running theme of our report, too. If we fail to address this collectively as a global community, we will suffer the consequences, and worse, the future generations will suffer. So, I mean, it sounds very cliche, but we are at a critical juncture. And we really need to confront these interconnected global risks. And we need to ensure that we're ready to address them. So that's what this report is all about. It builds on the need to anticipate, prevent, and prepare for the many challenges we face together. And, obviously, from the perception survey, and I mean, we don't even have to do a survey, just look around. It's a sobering world that we're in. But we also tried a strategic foresight approach. So it's a combination of perception survey and strategic foresight. So, I mean, that's the key thing also is that let's not get stuck in a doom and gloom, we're so depressed mode. There are possibilities for a better future. And what we do today shape the future. So that is really the point of this report. And the central question that runs through the entire report is, are we ready for the challenges of global risks? And to answer this, we undertook an extensive risk identification process. I mean, some of you heard it in another panel, but we analyzed over 100 risks that are commonly used in existing risk reports across the steep categories. You all know this, I assume, social, technological, economic, environmental, and political categories. But what's unique about it is that we then ran them through our specialized UN agencies, focal points from the whole UN system. We also then did workshops with our regional commissions in all 5 regions, and then reviewed the final list of risks with our senior management through Secretary General's cabinet, and then finished with the 28 most important global risks. So this process formed the basis of this report and the perception survey. And obviously, I don't have to tell you that perceptions are not reality. They shape a reality. So how we perceive risks and which risks perceive affect the strategies and actions we take towards risk management. So shared knowledge and consensus set the foundation for cooperative action. And in doing this survey, we really took pains to make sure that we had a truly inclusive set of experiences and perspectives. So we involved member states, civil society, private sector, and risk experts, and UN colleagues, including resident coordinators from all 130 countries. So, I mean, I do think that's probably the most inclusive and diverse survey that has ever been conducted in this area and from all regions of the world. And we surveyed over thousands, so I mean, really the hugest outreach, global compact companies, and so on and so forth. And as I said, we used strategic foresight to evaluate different possibilities and outcomes. And the team employed a hybrid approach, combining qualitative and quantitative approaches to conduct scenario analysis, developing archetypes of 4 possible futures, and exploring their different dynamics, risk interactions. And that's what was so interesting about it, is that we can, through these scenarios, we can see how the interactions play out. And so what can be, right? The report was asking based on how we act today. So what did we find? Most importantly, we found that there was broad consensus, a shared understanding across all different stakeholders, different regions, of the most important risks. Stakeholders agree on which risks are most important based on a combined ranking of imminence and severity. That maybe you, as risk experts, probably isn't a surprise, but I mean, I think it's a good basis to start with. So regardless of location, sector, political and environmental risk came out as central risks, and nearly everybody agreed, for example, that geopolitical tensions and climate inaction require urgent action. And as I said, the report also highlighted that how global risks are interconnected. And this was very interesting, at least as a non-expert, for me to look at. So, for example, geopolitical risks, tensions, really are connected to so many other risks, which is daunting because that's the crux of the problem. But at the same time, I mean, you could also see that somehow, if this can improve, that could also open up possibilities for other risks addressed. Obviously, that's one of the hardest nuts to crack, but I mean, it is interesting to see how global financial crisis can trigger a debt crisis, climate change inaction can lead to natural resource shortages. So this cascading and simultaneous occurrences is a challenge. But as I said, the opportunities are the interesting ones. Acting on climate could reduce natural hazard risks, address, and so on and so forth. So how do we limit the domino effect of cascading risk? One of the questions that we will be asking. So another thing that I think our report focuses on more than other report is that it looked at multilateral system as having a key role in responding to and addressing global risks. And then again, this is not a surprise to you, I'm sure. There is quite a gap between what people know about risks and what we're doing about it. So even though we agree on the most important risks, many responded that we're not well prepared to address them, and there are significant barriers for many of the most important risks. And then this can be attributed to lack of coordination, lack of information, political disagreement, lack of political will, and so on and so forth. So, and then again, I'm not going to get into the strategic foresight aspect of it because I'm sensing that I'm running out of time. But so this is to say that we need to double down on multilateral cooperation, and that's one of the key takeaways from this report. So I just really want to leave with a message that we share your call, leverage our existing strength and capacity towards effective action, and whether we advocate or innovate or invest or educate, it is our collective responsibility to address these risks. So I heed your call to action, really completely align myself with that, because the choices we make today will shape the future for generations to come, and by working together on these challenges, we can create a safer, more sustainable future. So thank you for the invitation.
Great, thank you very much. So up next, It's my pleasure to introduce Kamal Kishore, who's the Assistant Secretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. I did cut some other titles. We'll leave it there. Who's going to be speaking to you about the recently published UN Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, commonly known as GAR.
Thank you, ASRA, and thank you, UN Foundation, for this opportunity to have this interaction. So we've been talking about systemic risk for quite some time. The report that is in your hands is that it's a well-known concept, but what is new about systemic risk now, and how do we address it? What are the challenges, and what are some of the opportunities that the 21st century offers us? So what I'm going to do this afternoon, I don't know whether you can qualify it as this would qualify as a keynote address, but just some random thoughts. In three parts. First, I will try to make the whole notion of systemic risk vivid by a real example. Second, I'll talk about what we can learn from the past. And the third, how we can address systemic risk, some ideas. And finally, I will leave you with a story which will underline the honest hope. Summer, exceptionally hot summer, consistently over weeks, temperatures higher than normal in high mountains. A glacial lake becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it breaches. When it breaches, so much water comes down from 4,500 meters to 2,000 meters, 1,500 meters within a matter of 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It erodes lots of slopes, creates multiple landslides, creates smaller lakes on the steps. Then those also breach. It comes with a lot of debris. It blows up a hydroelectric dam, 500 megawatts. There is no electricity in the communities. Many people lose their lives. Mobile phones don't have a power backup for more than 8 hours. Mobile phones stop to work. ATM machines stop to work because there's no communication. People are not looking for assistance. They want access to their own cash, but they can't draw because the banks are not functioning, ATM machines are not working, markets have collapsed. Subsistence farmers who rely on going to the market, selling things every day, making a living, have lost their livelihoods. Their humanitarian needs are extended from what would have been just a few weeks to months. And at the intersection of each one of these nodes, each one of these steps of cascades, you have glaciologists, you have geologists, you have hydraulic engineers, you have hydrologists, you have community-based people, you have dam engineers, and all of them have never seen each other, never spoken to each other, and never discussed how what they know about their bit of risk connects with the others. So this is what we are dealing with. When we talk about systemic risk, we don't necessarily have to talk about specific events. We're talking about systems, but events help us understand systemic risk like nothing else. In the wake of a changing climate, I'm getting to the second part. In the wake of changing climate, there's a cliche that past is no longer a good guide for the future. But as they say, past is always with us. In fact, it's not even the past. It is with us. So it is really important that we look at major events, major disasters, whether they are single hazard, multiple hazard, whether they affect one sector or multiple sectors, and really learn from them. Look at not just their proximate causes. So if, the city of Brisbane was flooded, it is not just about the excessive rainfall. There are many other underlying processes of development that had inherent vulnerabilities that were exposed by extreme rainfall. It takes a little bit, we have to be less intellectually lazy and see what is unseen. Unseen factors which actually, when they are collided with extreme events, they cause disasters. And that's where my plug for a UNDRR report it was on Wednesday, I think, we launched a report. It's called Forensic Insights for a Resilient Future. We've looked at 10 major events starting from 2017 Mexico earthquake up to 2024 events, and looking at each event using a specific methodology. This is not a post-disaster needs assessment or a damage assessment. It is really an assessment of causality in all its nuances and really making the unseen seen so that we learn better. And more important part, more than the report, is that, we should learn lessons, but who learns the lessons? Who needs to learn the lesson? And who needs to apply the lesson? So the key thing about this approach, the forensic approach to understanding past disaster events, is that it's not done just by experts. It's done by, in my earlier example, the hydraulic engineer who was managing the dam, the glaciologist who was observing the glaciers, the hydrologist who's supposed to look at how a mountain river flows, a communications engineer who needs to account for not just 7 hours of backup, perhaps 7 days of backup for that situation. So it's really important that the learning that happens from these events is a collective learning by those who really need to learn and actually apply. So that's about how we can learn from the past events. The third segment of my talks, what can we do about it? I think we need to do more and more analytical work at the intersection of disciplines. We have, I think in the last 20 years, the global practice of disaster and climate risk assessment has come a long way, but it is still done hazard by hazard. We have to also get comfortable with qualitative analysis, with a very large band of uncertainty around it, where, we are very good at modeling earthquakes, we are very good at modeling floods, we are very good at modeling landslides, but we don't know how these things connect with each other. And sometimes it will not be very easy to quantify these connections, but of course this practice is also developing really rapidly. And I think in just a few years, the risk assessment methodologies will look very different. The second is democratization of risk information. We think that democratizing risk information will dilute it, create panic. No. Making risk information available is very empowering. And then finally, the issue of how our financial systems, how our risk governance systems are geared. They are still able to address single event, single hazards. To do it in a systemic way will require a different thing. Now the story of hope. The 2004, 26th December, was perhaps the largest global disaster before the pandemic. 5 countries, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Maldives, were very badly affected directly. People in Northern Europe, up to Sweden, lost their lives because they were having Christmas holidays. Seychelles, Somalia, so many other countries were also affected. At that time, we had about 20% of the world covered with a tsunami early warning system. Now we have 100%.
All right, last but not least, welcome Ruth back up to talk about this beautiful report. Ruth.
Thank you. Hello again. Thank you, Ayaka and Kamal, and so great to hear the synergies in our work, and we look forward to finding other ways to collaborate. So ASRA is driven by the belief that the world needs a radical new approach to respond to global systemic risk. But what does that actually look like? To answer that question, we drew upon the deep expertise and wisdom of over 50 transdisciplinary risk experts from around the world that make up the ASRA network, as well as with other diverse stakeholders from indigenous leaders to humanitarian champions to private sector actors. Out of that process, and under the leadership of our Director of Systemic Risk Assessment, AJ Gambier, who is somewhere in the room, Wave, there's AJ. Under the leadership of AJ came the report that you now have in hand, Facing Global Risks with Honest Hope. Our intention was simple. We wanted to catalyze a much-needed conversation and to surface the critical actions needed to ensure a safer, more resilient future for people, the planet, and all living species and ecosystems. On behalf of the ASRA network, we offer it as a critical contribution to this global imperative. This report underscores the urgent need for a reset in how we assess and respond to risk, and argues that building the capacity to do so is central to tackling this polycrisis moment. It gets to the rub of the two-sided question. How do we understand systemic risk, and what can we do about it? As it relates to the first question, how do we understand systemic risk? ASRA defines systemic risk as, quote, the potential for multiple, increasingly severe, abrupt, differentiated yet interconnected, and potentially long-lasting and complex impacts on coupled natural and human systems. It's quite a mouthful, but we've seen it already, haven't we? Most recently in the interconnected impacts of war and conflict on food security, migration, geopolitical instability, biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on. Risks are connected and have the potential to trigger and amplify other risks, making every system more vulnerable. A question that came up in our research was, well, we've always had risks. What's different this time? Yes, we faced trouble before, and there are echoes of history in our current polycrisis. But what is unique about this moment is, first of all, this polycrisis is now truly planetary in nature, as we have increased our environmental footprint beyond safe limits. Secondly, new technologies have the potential to do widespread harm. And thirdly, our communities, our societies, our economies are now more interconnected than they ever have been before. This must all be part of the understanding of systemic risk. But the question is more complex. We must dig deeper and expand the question, asking risk for whom and from what, when and where. Bears the burden? Benefits? To help guide our thinking, we at ASRA developed a set of principles to articulate what we collectively value as a navigational guide or a compass. Our principles place justice and equity, particularly for the most vulnerable communities and future generations, at the center of risk assessment and response. They recognize the interdependence of human and non-human life and the inherent value of species and ecosystems. They acknowledge accelerating industrialization, technological change, and environmental degradation as key drivers of risk. And they call upon the meaningful consideration of diverse knowledge and evidence to ensure that risk assessment and associated responses are relevant to affected communities. This also must be part of our understanding. So now to the second question, what do we do about it? We may not know the sequence of events that will lead to the next great global shock, but we can work now to ensure our systems, our societies, our communities, our organizations are better able to mitigate, prepare for, adapt to, and even transform away from the next crisis. Our report outlines a number of actions we can take. They are by no means comprehensive, but they do offer immediate and actionable ways to accelerate individual and organizational capacity and site change. First of all, we suggest appointing systemic risk officers at national, subnational, and even UN levels so that leaders have the express mandate to assess and respond to systemic risk. Secondly, we propose that corporations and financial institutions include the consideration of systemic risk in investment, lending, and procurement to understand and make visible the full costs and consequences of their activities. Thirdly, we recommend that public and private sector actors invest in new data, identify evidence and data blind spots and areas of bias, and share data publicly. Fourthly, we propose that researchers and educators promote transdisciplinary research and global collaborations. Fifth, we strongly promote the inclusive participation and active role of citizens and civil society in decision-making structures and processes about global risks. And finally, we call on philanthropic, public, private, and multilateral funders to radically increase funding to meet systemic crises with systemic responses. The report title is Facing Global Risks with Honest Hope. So, final word on hope. Honest hope is grounded in acknowledging the severity of our challenges while recognizing the immense possibility for innovation, change, and resilience. It is not naive optimism, but a clear-eyed understanding, have the tools, resources, and knowledge to face these risks if we choose to act. As we stand here on the cusp of the Summit of the Future, the world's decision makers and leaders must act with honest hope and adopt a fundamentally different approach to assessing and responding to systemic risk. Part of my summer reading was a book by Karen O'Brien called Matter More Than You Think. In it, she talks about what she calls the paradox of mattering. She says, quote, "Most people recognize that humans matter when it comes to transforming the global environment. However, many of us feel that we do not matter when it comes to deliberately transforming ourselves, our societies, and our systems to meet the challenges that we are facing today." Let us remember that addressing systemic risk isn't just about avoiding catastrophe. It's about creating a future where human, ecological, and planetary well-being thrive together. It's about mattering. That's why we're all here, yes? Together, we matter more than we think. Thank you.
Thank you to our keynote speakers. Next up, we're going to have a panel with 4 individuals who are going to dive deeper into the themes that were introduced by the keynote speakers, and if they could start heading towards the stage, that would be great as I introduce them so we can dive straight into the panel. So we have Marjorie Kaufman, and we have representatives from government, civil society, finance, and academia. And they've been asked to talk about practical strategies, collaborative approaches, innovative solutions to addressing risk. So we have Marjorie Kaufman, who is the Secretary of Environment and Infrastructure from the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil and Vice President of ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. Tim Lenton, who's the Chair in Climate Change and Earth System Science at University of Exeter. Delilah Rothenberg, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Pre-Distribution Initiative, and Aish Makani, who's the advocacy co-lead for the Global Citizens Assembly Network. So we're going to have a question. Yes? We're going to have a question for each of them. If we have time, I'll throw them a second question, and if we have time, we're going to do a little bit of Q&A with the audience. I'll keep an eye on the clock. They've been all told that they have about 3 minutes and that I will start moving towards them if they're running long. So we're going to start with Marjorie, and I'm going to share the question, and then we have Bianca, who will be here to translate. So Marjorie, in the aftermath of the recent floods in your state, we would love to hear about what immediate and long-term measures your state took to build and rebuild resilience against future climate risk, and how were local communities and other stakeholders engaged in this effort.
Ok. Boa tarde, muito obrigada pelo convite, pela presença de poder estar aqui entre grandes nomes e pensadores da pauta climática.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here amongst great names of resilience and climate agenda.
O Estado do Rio Grande do Sul, como poder executivo estadual, criou o Plano Rio Grande. O Plano Rio Grande se trata de um novo plano de governo que traz a reconstrução adaptada e resiliente às mudanças climáticas. E este plano tem entre os seus principais tópicos a participação da sociedade científica e da sociedade civil em conselhos específicos.
Well, after the disaster, the state government of Rio Grande do Sul has created the Rio Grande Plan. So what's it called? And this plan is being made by many hands, including participatory councils with scientific and communities engage in this, in building this plan. And this plan is willing to recover the state in a participatory and more sustainable and resilient way.
Em segundo ponto importante, nós já tínhamos e fortalecemos o Proclima 2050, que é um plano de adaptação a mudanças climáticas que traz comissões municipais conectando as cidades ao Estado, tanto no conhecimento como na implementação de ações de resistência.
Well, even before the catastrophe, we were already working on the climate action plan of the state, which is being built, of course, with all of the municipalities of the state, and it has also many participatory instances. And
que conecta os municípios ao Estado na execução e planejamento da parte climática.
Yeah, so it connects the municipalities and the states in the execution of the climate actions of the state.
E por fim, gostaria de colocar aqui o que já foi mencionado anteriormente, que nós precisamos olhar para os lados e olhar para trás.
We also need to look around to both sides and to look behind.
Não é possível que as pessoas que estão na ponta participem apenas da execução de estratégias que foram assumidas e colocadas por entes superiores.
It's not possible that people and states and cities that are in the front of the challenges can be just implementers of solutions that are made by other instances of government.
Esta estratégia coletiva de todas as partes de adaptação é o que vai trazer a nossa resiliência, que nada mais é do que a sobrevivência da espécie humana no planeta.
So this collective strategy for resilience is the only way to build together
da adaptação, que vai trazer a resiliência, que nada mais é do que a sobrevivência.
Yeah, so only the gathering of specialists and the whole approach of society could bring the solutions to bring resilience, that it's about saving human species.
Obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We're going to go to Tim next, and we'd like to hear from you, Tim, about an example of cutting-edge research or inspirational policy or practice addressing risks that we can learn from.
Thanks, and congratulations on this report and the other ones we heard about as well. And my pet subject is tipping points and tipping point risks, and in that context, many of us in the field that I work in are now trying to understand how tipping points may cascade in a bad way. If you want a quick reminder about what a tipping point is, you can always lean back on your chair. And, you know that there's sometimes in systems a small nudge one way or the other makes a big difference to your fate. But what's interesting is sometimes it's also like when the proverbial dominoes are lined up and you tip one system, and that leads to abrupt and often very hard to reverse change. But if we're really unlucky, we get the kind of systemic risk where tipping one system can tip the next domino and the next. So what we're trying to do, I'm a climate scientist principally, but I'm concerned with lots of complex systems, human and otherwise. So one of the things we're trying to do in my field now is just begin to understand how, for example, the big tipping points that are in the Earth's climate couple together. So you might have heard about the possibility that we tip the breakdown of, say, the Greenland ice sheet, and it's pouring meltwater into the North Atlantic Ocean. But you might also have heard that the circulation of the North Atlantic Ocean, or the whole Atlantic Ocean, can be tipped. It can be switched off. And in fact, the thing that can switch it off is the meltwater that's pouring off the ice sheets thanks to the global warming. And when that circulation collapses, Earth's history already tells us it has horrible repercussions. It can tip the monsoons in West Africa, around the planet in India, and also in South America over the Amazon off or much weaker, with huge humanitarian implications. So what we're trying to do first is just begin to map out those storylines, horrific though they are, and we do that by taking the tools and the models usually that we have at our disposal. But as we heard from Kamal and others, you've really also got to, I think, try and find ways to bring these risks to life by playing that through to the beginnings of thinking about its human consequences. And actually, as I sat listening to the speakers, I was thinking, well, I love a good report. I've written a big one or two myself. But I think we also need small snippet videos or a whole series of pieces that tell the stories of systemic risk like we heard. I also think we should be playing systemic risk games, virtual or otherwise, where we it's not a war game, it's let's try and cope with systemic risk together, where we're hit with a scenario and we're learning what it's like to be in that situation. And so, apart from mapping out these risks, what am I or my group trying to do to cope with something like a tipping point risk? Well, basically, before a system hits a tipping point, it tells you it's coming in the sense that, well, in our language we say it loses resilience, but basically the world is full of little shocks, but a system nearing a tipping point gets worse at recovering from the little shocks. And we were trying to use, for example, data, remotely sensed data, to see how fast the different systems respond to the shocks, like a tornado comes through and takes the lights out, how fast do the lights come back on? So right now, resilience sensing, we call it, is something we can do with real data to see, are we close to tipping points?
Thanks, Tim. All right, I'm going to turn to Delilah next, and we'd love to hear about how the finance and investment sector evolve in 5 to 10 years.
Sure, thanks so much. And hi, everybody. My name is Delilah Rothenberg, and I'm a co-founder and the executive director of the Pre-Distribution Initiative, not redistribution, but pre-distribution, fixing the cycles through which wealth is created in the first place, so we don't have to be dependent on redistribution or remedying something after the fact. We're a nonprofit founded in 2019 that works with institutional investors and their stakeholders to co-create improvements to investment structures and investment governance practices to share more wealth and influence with workers and communities. And we believe that is essential in order to address systemic issues and risks like inequality and climate change and biodiversity loss. It's very much a nothing about us without us approach, and that's a motto from the disability movement. We have 3 work streams. One is on measurement and evaluation, so working with investors to evaluate their own practices and measure their actions and the outcomes from those actions. We have a work stream on capacity building or management with investors to change the way they govern themselves to consider systemic factors, as well as co-create financial analysis tools to be able to measure those dynamics and integrate that into their financial analysis and asset allocation and pricing and structuring, decision making. And then a last work stream on evaluating what investment structures are more regenerative for the economy, for society, for the environment versus more extractive. And I come to this work after 15 years, now at this point 20, working in the financial services industry in public equities and private equity infrastructure and project finance. And I went into the field because I saw the potential of investors and capital to really transform systems. They influence systems and they set incentives, or capital influences system and sets incentives, and investors do, whether we like it or not, or whether it's good or bad. It can go either way, right? And so I saw, as I was graduating from university, an opportunity to attract capital to undercapitalized areas of the world, to small, medium-sized enterprises, and help people build their agency and have influence over their own futures, shape their own futures. But what I realized from working in finance is that a lot of the investment structures that we use, and the financial analysis tools and the governance mechanisms actually lead to more extractive practices. Now, the hope is, and my inspiration is, that is changing. There's a concept of universal ownership that is emerging, and it's the idea that pension funds and insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds and endowments are, and even your typical retail investor are very diversified. And particularly the large institutions, they're long-term and they're diversified across every industry, geography, and asset class. And we heard earlier, there are no corners to hide from system-level risks, right? Systemic and systematic. And so these investors are starting to realize that these systemic or systematic risks are affecting their portfolios, and that the majority of their return actually is influenced by systematic factors and climate change and equality and biodiversity loss. And so they're starting to care not only about the risk and return of each individual investee in their portfolio, but also the externalities, positive and negative externalities. So I see you inching closer to me. So I'll stop there, and maybe we'll pick it up in another question. Thanks.
We'll have more time. Great. All right. And last but not least, Aish, we'd love to hear from you, something near and dear to my heart and our work at Meridian, which is how to better engage diverse stakeholders, local communities, international bodies.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to be talking today about citizens' assemblies. Can I have a show of hand for how many people know what a citizens' assembly is? Okay, pretty good. Just to recap though, citizens' assemblies, because the definitions vary, citizens' assemblies bring together a snapshot of the population, selected by lottery to be demographically representative according to gender, age, and other characteristics. And the members of these assemblies are then supported to go through a collective learning journey where they are supported to learn facts through clips and gamified processes about a variety of issues. They then deliberate and vote on solutions. And we've seen that citizens' assemblies around the world are supporting collective learning, equipping people to start demanding change in their communities. They are coming up with concrete and consensual solutions to seemingly intractable problems, which is helping to break gridlocks and drive institutional ambition and action. And they're also, by bringing together diverse stakeholders, helping to build solidarity. Now imagine if we could replicate this at a global level. In 2021, the first ever Global Citizens Assembly was organized for COP26. It asked citizens to answer the question, how can humanity address the climate and ecological crisis in a fair and effective way? Simple. But the mission of this assembly was to give everyone on Earth a seat at the global governance table. So it consisted of a core assembly, but it also asked anyone on Earth to run their own assemblies and go through the same learning journey, and the data from these assemblies was fed into the core assembly. It was also supported by a cultural wave of artists and influencers and media practitioners to kind of raise awareness of the assembly and its recommendations. So this was a prototype, but imagine if this was a permanent governance institution that was radically inclusive, giving young people, women, and people from the global majority a fair voice on issues of global risks, fostering global solidarity, and building resilience to systemic risks. So in recognition of this potential, a growing coalition of organizations and the governments of Brazil and Vanuatu are supporting a global citizens assembly for people and planet that's being launched on Monday. Our hope for this assembly is that it will help to shape COP30 so that it truly becomes the people's COP that we're all waiting for, and that it will also help to lay the foundations for a permanent global citizens assembly. Very happy to answer any questions you might have and to chat about it after.
Well, thanks to our keynote speakers and our panelists for sticking with the rules. We've got time for a second question, and then we'll have some time also for some questions from the audience. So be thinking if there's a question that you'd like to put to the panel. So my second question, and we'll just, whatever order people, we don't have to go one by one here. Whoever's inspired to jump in first. So is there a key action or commitment that you would like to see coming out of this meeting that could be taken forward by ASRA and the other stakeholders are here? And want to jump in? Yes, Marjorie, it looks like you're ready.
Ok. Creio que o que seria importante nesta reunião é nós consolidarmos o que foi falado aqui, porque foram posições muito diversas.
Well, I think what is important about this meeting is that we can achieve to consolidate what's being said here, because there are diverse opinions and points of view.
Além disso, a questão da consolidação da educação e da cultura do risco em todas as escalas.
The huge need is the consolidation of education and risk culture in all of the communities
Thank you.
and levels.
Thank you very much. Who wants to jump in next? Tim? All right.
Might be ambitious, but I'd love us to make a little vox pop piece together on systemic risk, which brings it to life, that maybe tells a few crucial stories visually and compellingly with human voices of what it means to be in systemic risk, not just reading a wonderful but rather dry report in a beautiful, calm setting, and that we put our heads together to kind of navigate what that experience is like, because I think that's the best way we can begin to communicate this concept out to the wider audience we need to reach.
Great. And maybe I'm going to be sounding out of touch, but I heard the term vox pop for the first time today. I didn't know what it was. Kasia was kind enough to explain it to me, but it's voice of the people. And so, yes, thank you, Tim. Great. Lila, you want to go next? We seem to be going in order.
Sure. Well, I spend a lot of time thinking about fiduciary duty and the interpretation of fiduciary duty, institutional investors, and they sort of look to policymakers and regulators and their stakeholders for indications of how to interpret fiduciary duty. And, I think it's really important to reinforce the idea that these investors' fiduciary duties are intergenerational, and they shouldn't just be focused on returns today, but potential returns in the future. And we should recognize that, to continue on for these institutions, which many of them are long-term, you think about a pension fund, they have a duty of impartiality, as there are a couple of lawyers who do a really good job of articulating this, Keith Johnson and Tiffany Reeves say. And their fiduciary duties are not just to their beneficiaries today, but their beneficiaries in the future. And so we really need to think about the interdependence of financial capital on human capital and social capital and natural capital, and find ways to reconnect how we think about the value of financial capital with those other capitals. Does financial capital just represent some imaginary thing out there that we bid up and down, or is it supposed to be representative of real world value? And so, to allow investors to pursue a fiduciary duty that values all capitals, we also need to think about new financial analysis tools to be able to really re-embody those kinds of connections. And then I think, if we can get global policymakers and regulators and decision makers to co-create, these solutions together with investors and their stakeholders, workers, and communities, then we'll start to see capital shift in ways that have more regenerative investment structures too. So, I think there already are initiatives that are emerging. There's a task force on inequality and social-related financial disclosures, which is launching this coming week, and I have a number of colleagues in the audience here who are also working on that together with us. And we're working on a project with another organization, the Responsible Asset Allocator Initiative as well, on evolving away from financial benchmarks, traditional financial benchmarking practices, because a lot of investors, I think we heard earlier that past performance is no guarantee of future performance, right? Especially when you've got these risks, and yet investment teams are constantly trying to meet or exceed a financial benchmark that doesn't account for externalities. So there's a lot to do. I think I'm sort of going over all of the different things that we're working on, and I don't know if we can narrow in on one of them in particular, but they're all sort of interconnected and work together. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it short because I can sense that time is running out. But yeah, I think I'm just going to second what Ruth said in her remarks, is that it's not just about supporting people from around the world to understand systemic risks, but giving them structural mechanisms to have a say in how we tackle them. And I'm going to make a special point here about especially giving young people a structural mechanism to have a say in these things, because if we're thinking about future risks, systemic risks, they are the people that are closely connected to the future and will inherit whatever it is that we decide to do today.
Thank you. As you may know, we have ASRA Next Gen cohort that started Thursday night that are the members of the Next Gen cohort are here. Maybe you can just, if you're a member of the Next Gen cohort, put your hand in the air. So they're scattered around the room. And they've been working very hard yesterday, today, and tomorrow morning. So catch them at the reception where they'll be unwinding a bit. Okay, so we've got time for a few questions. That's what I was going to ask. Let me see. We're not going to be able to get to everyone, but I'll take at least a few, and then people will be here for Q&A. So I'm going to take 1, 2, 3 here, and I'm going to do these 3 first, and I'll help you track the questions. We'll get all 3 onto the floor. You can think about them, and we don't have to answer them one by one. So if you could introduce yourselves first.
I'm Gaia Harrington. I'm a sustainability researcher. I did a journal on the limits to growth. I have a question for Delilah. I recognized your story a little bit. I also started in finance and also left very disillusioned. So my question is about fiduciary duty. It's very clear, I think, with that there are global risks in the portfolios, also because they're bigger than ever. So there really is nowhere to hide. In that sense, I'm not that afraid that they won't fund eventually the clean energy transition. But most of these global risks for them in the portfolio, I think, are still environmental. I wonder about how just that transition is going to be, because the fiduciary duty is, sure, maybe future generations, but the majority of Americans don't have a 401k. Even the ones that have it in principle, there's less than $200 in it. So the fiduciary duty is really to the top 10%. So how do you see that role of things like income and wealth inequality, just a level of sufficiency? How are they what's the role of finance there?
And if we have time for more questions, we will, but let me try to get these.
I'm Erica Gregory. I'm the president of Horizon 2045, and this is really for anyone who's willing to take this question. So the Pact for the Future looks like it could get hung up because of resistance to language about nuclear weapons, which is one of the risks that hangs over all of us, and in fact threatens to derail the good work that many of us are doing on other issues. I'm curious to know how anybody thinks about how we might handle that kind of risk.
Thank you. Okay. 3rd question, then we'll come back to our panel. Yes. Elias.
Hello, everybody. Elias Koch, part of the Next Gen cohort. My question is to you, Tim. How much can we know about when the tipping point is coming and how early?
Great. Okay, so we've got one question specifically for Tim, one for Delilah, and then a question for all of you. So Tim, maybe I could start with you.
How well can we know when a tipping point is coming? Well, like all things, it's how good is the data. But what I want to get across, maybe I did already, is often we instinctively think a tipping point would be completely unpredictable, and that isn't true. And even if you think about the simple example I gave of the leaning back on the chair, if you're near the balance point, things actually move a little bit slower there, although they suddenly accelerate when you start tipping. And that's actually quite a general phenomena, that systems slow down and they undergo bigger and more sluggish excursions before they tip. And we can use that, certainly if we have the data, to both estimate how close we could be to tipping and how fast we might be heading towards it. But it is if we have the data. So if we were asking about the climate examples I gave, it becomes a question of statistics in a sense. Can you get a reliable, can I give a confident statistic? And let's say we've got something like we're worried about the tipping of the Amazon rainforest. We know it could tip because of fires and droughts, maybe in the space of decades. But we're going to need to monitor it for many decades to be able to pick up the signal, or several decades to pick up the signal that stability is being lost. And that's exactly what we've been trying to do and been able to do with satellite records since about 1979. But there are other slower systems, ice sheets, that we should still really care about their tipping, where we really struggle to get the data we would need to use this approach. That said, scientists are clever. We set them to task and they find ways of going back and doing, we call it paleoclimate research. They find ways of reconstructing the variability of the ice sheet or some system before. And my message would be, of course, we've always got finite time and effort to go after these problems. But if we agree as systemic risk assessors that, we really should put some time and effort into tooling ourselves up better to warn of what we think would be really devastating tipping points, then there are these concrete ways of, saying, well, what's the best place to put my effort? I need a longer record, let's put the effort there, or I need higher resolution, let's get a new satellite up. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Delilah, can I turn to you to talk about fiduciary responsibility and duty?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question. When we think about an investment portfolio or an investment, the actual commercial entity has impacts, right, on people and the environment. It has dependencies on people and the environment to succeed. So in terms of people, a diversified portfolio might be dependent on social stability, right? And then the investment can have risks and opportunities that manifest from those dependencies and impacts. And so if you think about what's going on in the world right now when it comes to socioeconomic inequality and poverty, we have a number of dynamics across both developed and developing countries in terms of rising polarization, loss of trust, feeling like the middle class is slipping away. We have poverty that's driving migration patterns that are exacerbating social tensions. And we have rising protectionism as well from a number of dynamics, inequality, migration, and that is leading to trade wars, geopolitical conflict, none of which is good for portfolios. And so when we think about the intergenerational fiduciary duty, what the idea is the investors want to minimize the negative impacts in their portfolios that are on people that are driving these kinds of dynamics and try to improve them so that they have their portfolios are dependent on the health of the economy is dependent on the health of human and social and natural systems, so they have that kind of stability, and that's really the idea behind it. I'd also say that there are studies and there's evidence that inequality, particularly in developed markets, can drive secular stagnation, which leads to different dynamics with interest rates and potential asset bubbles and credit crises. So there are dynamics that can affect the stability of portfolios there as well. And then lastly, I think what we've seen around the world is that inequality and this deterioration of trust is also driving political gridlock when it comes to climate solutions and nature solutions in some cases. And so if we really believe that climate is a systemic risk or a systematic risk that can trigger systemic risk, then by proxy, inequality and social issues are as well.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll go to our third question, open to any of you. She said, any of you brave enough to take on the question or something like that, which was related to language around nuclear weapons and how it's taking the focus off of other good work that people are doing. Aisha, it looks like you've got your microphone ready to go.
I feel like it's fair that I put my take this one, but I will do my best to answer what I think is a very difficult question. I think the challenge here is that things like nuclear disarmament will ultimately only be resolved through multilateral cooperation. It's something that affects countries. It doesn't stop at borders. But we know that for multilateralism to do what we need it to do, it needs to be reinvigorated. But we also know that that reinvigoration is depending on multilateral negotiations. So we're now in a bit of a catch-22. We're seeing it with the Pact of the Future, as you're saying. It looks like it's going to collapse because member states can't seem to agree on a way forward. And I think then the question becomes, what can we do from the outside to put pressure on the inside? And here I have no kind of silver bullet or magical solution that no one's thought of before. I think change happens when there is a coalition of the willing and the correct window of opportunity. I guess the only thing I can say is that I think there are willing people, and the ironic thing is that often windows of opportunities happen during times of breakdown, which I think is fair to say we might be seeing at this time.
Thanks. Anyone else care to address that question? No. They're saying no. So let me see if there's any other questions. So maybe there's no one over here. Okay. We'll take here and Frank. Here, I know Frank, so we'll take, and then back here, Sabrina. Yep. Great. All right. So we'll take these two questions and then we'll transition to our closing. Ruth and our guest.
Hi, Rumton from Global Shield. If there's any, I guess, implication of systemic risk is that we can't play whack-a-mole with each threat or hazard as it arises. So I'm interested to get your perspectives on if there's a positive cascade, if there's one point that you can, if we influence that at a policy level or at a systemic level, it cascades positively to across the system and make sure our chair doesn't fall backwards.
Okay, great. Positive cascade, and then Frank. Then we'll turn back to our panelists and need to wrap up. Get you out of here on time. Frank.
Yeah, Frank Van Gansbeck is co-founder of Beyond Bretton Woods and in Disclosure, also working with Delilah in that project. I had a question for Tim. So 2 miles away from here, we have a whole community ecosystem which is totally agnostic, market-wise about and pricing-wise about systemic risk. We have the Fed, major central banks, again, don't want to look into systemic risk. And one of the issues you hear from those participants is that they say we can't calibrate it. It's so difficult to calibrate and to put our arms around. Do you have a solution for both elements, to make our markets less agnostic about systemic risk, and that, we can have some impetus for central banks to embrace systemic risk as a major input to increase capital?
Okay, so a question about positive cascade. Another question. Yes, Marjorie, want to jump in? We need a microphone, though. Bianca. Thank you.
Com relação à parte positiva sistêmica e também condicionante da capacitação multinível, eu acredito que nós temos modelo interessante.
Well, related to the positive impacts in the systemic cascade, I think that education is a turning point.
E condicionante, inclusive.
And conditioning point.
Nós estabelecemos no Estado procedimentos que condicionam repasses à preparação para o risco dos municípios.
So we established within the state. Repete, por favor.
Condicionamos os repasses à preparação para o risco dos municípios.
Yes, we conditioned the resources, the financial resources in the state to the cities and municipalities' preparation to risk catastrophes.
Com planos de contingência e de ordenamento urbano atualizados.
With contingency plans and urban planning updated.
Nós conseguimos ter melhores respostas.
We achieved to have better answers.
E multiplicação da preparação do todo.
And multiply the preparation of the whole.
Thank you. I'd like to jump in for other. It looks like you.
I'll have a go. I'm actually going to start with the positive cascade question.
Okay.
So it might seem a little bleak an answer, but there's definitely potential for a positive tipping cascade that's going to accelerate us towards zero greenhouse gas emissions, clean energy economy. We're releasing a report on Monday with our latest analysis of the potential not just to tip to solar and wind and 100% renewable power, but to electrification of mobility and of heating and cooling our homes, and finding that the tipping points in one sector do measurably bring forward the positive tipping points in another because of the sectoral couplings that for the first time we've been able to quantify and model. So in the broadest sense, that's what we need to get on top of the climate and ecological crisis, to accelerate the action that isn't happening on decarbonisation by at least a factor of 5. And that's, in the grandest picture of things, perhaps the most holistic thing we can do to control the risks from that otherwise escalating climate crisis. If I turn to the banks, and particularly the central bank's question, Well, I do occasionally hear from the Fed because we're on the National Academy's some kind of round table for 2 years on climate and macroeconomic risk. And it isn't a hopeless case, is what I'll say, or at least Adele from the Fed, who comes to these regular meetings, is switching on to these issues, as any central banker would be, because they had to deal with the 2007-8 financial crisis when they should have spotted it before, but they realized because of experience that there was an awful lot of fragility and systematic risk in the way the network of lending was in the economy. I think the question was great because it's like, God, they're slow. I mean, really, they're so slow. They're slow to internalize this stuff, as the questioner hints. They're still struggling to get climate in the baseline budget, 10-year budget projection in the US. I mean, come on, people. So it's partly institutional inertia, but it's not that there aren't bright people who are actually risk professionals because they're in the world of finance. So it's as if we have to perhaps it's an engagement exercise partly to switch on that risk skill that they have, to get it attuned to these issues. I think part of the problems was touched on in all the earlier points, though, that if you approach this imagining that you could, like, quantitatively map out all possible systemic risks, that would be crazy. It's never going to be possible. But that's not how the financial sector operates or handles the financial risks that hit it, like when there is a major financial crisis. And so it's not like we need to have it exhaustively mapped out. There's actually very established ways of acting decisively under uncertainty when that systemic risk seems sharp enough. So it's a bit of a meandering answer, perhaps, but I think it's like you suggested. It's about flipping a switch in the head almost, and in the institution to use actually the skills it has at its disposal and turn it on to the right things, when often I think they're wasting a lot of time and energy staring on the wrong things.
All right, thank you. Let's give a round of applause to our panel. My apologies to those of you who couldn't get to your questions, but please stay for the lovely reception, and you can hook one of the panelists or others to get your questions answered. All right, so for this final session, I'm going to turn it back to Ruth. Thank you, Ruth.
Okay. Well, I'm absolutely honored to have two members of the elders with us tonight. First, we have President Ernesto Zedillo, former president of Mexico. President Zedillo led profound democratic and social reforms, a renowned economist, and an advocate of multilateralism, inclusive globalization, nuclear non-proliferation, drug policy reform, and universal health care. He has been a champion and strong voice on nuclear disarmament, for a question earlier, and non-proliferation, and a promoter of global security and peace. Thank you for joining us. As well, we have President Ebedorj Sakia, hope I said that correctly, former President and Prime Minister of Mongolia. President Ebedorj is a public servant, a freedom fighter, and a policymaker from Mongolia, who led his country's transition to democracy after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. He was one of the key leaders of the Mongolian Democratic Revolution, and since then has continuously served Mongolia as a member of parliament 4 times, prime minister 2 times, and elected president for 2 terms. Thank you for joining us. So we're thrilled to have you both here, bringing your wisdom to help us reflect on what we've heard today and still what we have to do. I have sort of a 2-part question for both of you, and I'll ask you each in turn. So my question is that throughout today's discussion, we've touched on the complexities of global challenges like climate change, inequality, and conflict. and the need to think in systems and work together. As former heads of state, leaders of your government, and experts in national policy, I would love to hear reflections on the dialogue today. And I'd also love to hear what message you would offer to leaders and participants about the urgency of taking bold action on systemic risk, despite the uncertainty we face. So, two-part question, and maybe I'll just turn to each of you one by one. So first, President Elbadorj, please, your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm the one of the elders. We are 12 of us, and I regard the youngest elder. And of course, we focus on 4 issues, and pandemics, conflict, and climate change, threat of nuclear weapon, and also there is new issue now, new thing, and emerging AI. And we are focusing, and we are trying to bring our ideas to the broader communities. I think during my childhood, I experienced that there is going to be nuclear war, and I thought I am really unlucky. We're gonna all die from the nuclear war, but still here. And just there was last COP, I saw there was one prime minister saying that, it's midnight in terms of that climate change. After that passes midnight, I think humanity may perish. But still we are here. And means that, there are always emerging issues, challenges coming, but we address those issues as a humanity, as a community together. And I hope we can do it in the future. I'm quite optimistic in terms of the sharing knowledge, in terms of the sharing information. Actually, we are experiencing kind of the Renaissance time, In history of humanity, there was no time such a richness of knowledge, richness of opportunities of sharing that. And when it comes, for example, to pandemics, we are all worried about finding the vaccine or not. But that was they found it quickly, but they found it through the AI. All those things, traditionally that would take for 5 or 10 years. Actually, that took for several months. And through using that computational power, already we achieved. And means that there is also answer. When it comes to conflict and others, I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, when we asked General Assembly, 141 nations say that that's not good. They voted against. Now it's the, solving problems through war. It seems now obsolete. And because of that, I think there would be less conflict. And we all know that war is not a good solution. And I think when it comes to threat of nuclear weapon, of course, in 1986, there was 60,000 warheads, nuclear warheads. Now we have 13,000. Actually, 5-fold decreased that. But in the last 5-10 years, there was no less engagement, between 2 superpowers, the United States and Russia, which actually 84% all nuclear heads actually come to the Russia or to the USA. And when we used the first time nuclear weapon in Hiroshima, now 70 years, there was no use of nuclear weapons. I think as a generation, when we think about our future, and I think we need to think about what kind of mess we did in our home. How can we clean our house? I think we can clean our house from nuclear weapon. And my country is a only single state called nuclear weapon free status we have. And if most of the countries became that nuclear weapon free status, and I think in our lifetime we can get rid of nuclear weapons. If from this audience, I think we have to pay to this attention, and you can contribute to that. Out of this audience, that's one thing we need to raise awareness and to eliminate that nuclear weapon. If we do that, I think to our next generation, and we will do very good thing. When I talk about next generation, just recently I saw my grandchildren, and her mother is feeding her, and actually while her mother is feeding her, my grandchildren is using her phone and watching the cartoon. And I said it's not good, for children. It's using that mobile phone. And she said, no, if she didn't watch that, she cannot eat. But after a while, when she reached 2 years old, she already, access to her phone, and she knows, and she exactly find what to watch. And his brother, 4 years old, jumping and coming, he earned more points on video game than his father. Means that, we thought that wisdom comes with the age. But now our young generation, that alpha generation, already born very wise, very smart. I think we need clean up our house, what possible of trashes. But I think our young generations, if we give them all those knowledge, and I thought, okay, I cannot teach them AI or something. I have to switch to the traditional values. Focus on your study. Do your homework. All those things, and we need to bring that. That's my thought. Thank you very much.
So much, sir. A voice of hope and for the next generation. President Zizio, what about you?
Well, thank you for the invitation. Our chair has a rule when he sends two elders. He says, if Cedillo is going, then I need to send also somebody who is less pessimistic than Cedillo, because she knows that I belong to the dismal discipline, which is economics, and I happen to be, less optimistic than my dear colleague. And I also know that we have short time, because just like in the ABBA song about the Mexican Fernando, there is something in the air, and that's anxiety to go to drinks. I have anxiety to go to the chocolate store downstairs. But in any case, and I also saw, the title of your report, honest, and I said, well, honest, it makes sense. Number one, because if we are going to speak about global risk, and in our case we speak about the existential threats, we have to be honest and to admit, in my view, that we are in a bad place, really. What we have seen during recent decades is indeed that we have learned more. We have better tools that in principle could be used not only to analyze but to solve problems, but that basically we have been without effective action to address those issues. And the practical consequence of that is that the state variables of our planet, not only in terms of the health of our planet, but other important state variables that matter for the present and the future of humanity, have really deteriorated, right? And I think that has to do with a very simple fact, that most of those problems do require collective international action. Most of those problems have to do with the fact, if you start from the micro, that there is a big gap between the social cost and the private cost, or the social benefit and the private benefit. And that gap has to be filled by smart well-designed, and highly cooperative policies. And that's simply not happening. So this has been a movement not towards progress in addressing those issues, but rather a movement to understand better, that we have a lot of tail risks and that there is a high covariance among them, and that we can have tipping points that cause catastrophe, right? We speak, people like here, like me, speak like that, and then what? Then what? What are we doing to mitigate those risks? And the answer is, well, we need to have countries cooperating, and recognizing that we have to provide a global public good to mitigate and fix those problems. But what we have seen in recent decades, in the last 2 decades, is a deterioration of not only of the traditional international cooperation mechanisms, but in some cases, a systematic undermining of the multilateral institutions. Every forum that we have built, governments and whoever has the responsibility to address with those issues, either have been under attack or simply they move forward without producing effective mechanisms, where there are 3 basic ingredients that are always missing. Do we have the right governance? Do agree? Do we have mechanisms collectively agreed to monitor the state of the planet and the state of the issues, where we share the information, examine the problem? And number 3, do we have mechanisms? Even if we do all of the above, the 2 other conditions, do we have the mechanisms to enforce whatever is agreed by the international community? And even in the best of cases, the answer is no. We don't have the governance. We don't monitor properly. And people simply come to wherever, sign commitments, but they can just go home and do not comply with the obligations, if any, that they have taken. And for me, that's a real crisis, because if we continue to see this process, it's going to be really a disaster. Well, there is hope. Well, yes, as we speak, somebody is working a few blocks from here, or many people trying to produce something that will be the pact for the future. And that is, let's say, right now, the only game in town to stop the deterioration of the multilateral system, and probably start anew to rebuild some components of that system, and to have any expectation that something can be done to fix what it now today looks like a disaster. I just hope that those people are lucky, and we know that some country as of today was blocking the pact for the future. I think it will be tragic. Of course, if the pact goes forward and it's adopted, of course everybody will have observations and even criticisms, and some will feel disappointed because what they wanted to see there was not there. But dear friends, that's going to be the past. Let's start with that pact for the future and try to use it to move forward, because it will be the only game in town to be productive and to start building what we need. Of course, I would like to see, instead of 25 action, it's called actions, it says nuclear disarmament. Actually, I would like to see that as a number 1, because you know what? If that fails, then everything else is irrelevant. When I talk to my students, I say, yes, we should worry about global warming because of climate change. But you know what? Maybe we should worry more about global cooling, the global cooling that is going to be produced by any nuclear exchange that happens in the world. So I will put my preference issues of international peace and security and disarmament. But that doesn't matter. Whatever is there, the 50 plus actions and the additional documents, let's take that and let's push governments so that we start the reconstruction of the multilateral system. And we start abandoning what is now a fact of life. We no longer have a rules-based system. We have a power-based system. And we know what has happened in history when power has been the rule. It has been a human tragedy. Let's prevent that human tragedy again.
Thank you. So, a voice of hope and perhaps a dose of reality, and maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. And we can hold both together. Thank you so much, presidents and elders. Really appreciate your presence with us today. You guys have both so much experience, and you've been huge champions for many of the causes that we all care deeply about. So thank you for your work and your continued work in this new forum. So another round of applause, please. Thank you. Maybe if you'll just stay with me here for 2 seconds while I just wrap up, and then we have your mic up.
Yeah, 2 seconds is good.
2 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, our founder Mandela once said that, it always seems impossible until it's done. I think all those issues, problems today seems overwhelming. It's almost impossible to solve. But we make together our action, we work together. I think we can do that. And also, as elders, late Secretary General Kofi Annan said that you never old to learn, you never young to lead. That's a really good quote. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you very much.
Wonderful way to finish. Thank you. So I'm going to keep this really short. That's the end of our program. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to all of our speakers and panelists. The bar is open. And the bar is open. Thank you. There we go. On we go. Please help yourself. Thank you.